G'day, it's Paul Rowe here in my office again, my tool shed, where I shape stories and think stories through. I've been looking at my family history here, one my cousin Helen put together, and I was looking at this photograph here. This is my great-grandfather and my grandfather and his sister, about a bit before the turn of the 20th century, back in the 1890s. And there's a sad picture in some ways because there's a figure missing here. Obviously my great-grandmother's not there, and the reason is because she'd arrived only a few weeks before with these two children. Grandfather had been here a bit earlier, but yes, she passed away from typhoid up there in Newcastle after travelling on a boat. And thinking in these COVID times we're going through, we're here in lockdown in Dubbo, thinking about how vaccines and disease have affected my family. So my grandfather here, he went to the goldfields a little bit later when he was married, took his wife and little boy up to near Armidale, and that little boy, Eric, my uncle Eric, he passed away from diphtheria. He caught a diphtheria as part of an epidemic that took a lot of children. And then forward into my own family, my sister had polio, I had scarlet fever, and my grandfather Baird had TB, and we all had to go and have chest x-rays and immunisation and so on, and smallpox injections. So within my own lifetime and the lifetime of my family, disease has been a very real thing, and there's sort of this invisible story of medical help and vaccines in the background that's very relevant to what's happening to us right now. And there's a beautiful story I was researching this week about a guy called Edward Jenner, and about the same time as the first fleet sailed to Australia, he was working on finding a cure for smallpox, which was killing 400,000 people a year in Europe alone, in a much smaller population then, of course. And then wherever the Westerners went from Europe all around the world, the indigenous people suffered from these diseases that wiped them out in very, very big numbers. So we forget sometimes how serious and constant this affliction was, and then in our lifetime, my lifetime anyway, how we've seen a number of these major diseases disappear. So Edward Jenner worked on, he saw a girl worked in the dairy. He said, "Oh, I get cowpox and I don't get that smallpox," and so he worked on that and developed a vaccine. Vacca means cow in Latin, vaccine. And so he developed this, and in 1801 delivered a paper to the Royal Society, and within 3 years they were using it in Australia to vaccinate children, and that was part of his principle as a Christian man and a doctor and a man with a heart for the people. He said, we've got to give this as a free gift to people. You know, we don't charge them for it, and it doesn't matter rich or poor, everybody should have it available. So by mid-19th century, in the 1840s, Governor Gipps, who was another Christian man, called the medical community together, said we need to find a solution for our population here in Australia, and so they were developing the vaccine, smallpox vaccine, in Sydney by the mid-1840s. And by 1927, smallpox was gone from Australia, and by 1980 from the world, all through a vaccination program, which began with a Christian man with a heart for the people. You know, the interesting thing about Edward Jenner was that when he got such high praise, he was the man. People were saying he's probably saved more lives in history than any other single individual. Napoleon said he's the greatest benefactor to the human race. Well, he would probably point back and say, well, actually, I'm a follower of Jesus, who's the greatest benefactor. And just before he died, he said, you know, I'm not so fussed about people knowing me and knowing what I've done, but it saddens me to think that people don't give thanks to God for using someone like me to use my gifts that he's given me to bless others. That's quite a message, isn't it? In these times, to remind ourselves that men and women using their gifts to bless others, just like Jesus said. So when you're talking vaccination, think of Edward Jenner, think of a Christian man who says, don't forget to give thanks to God. So thanks for joining me. I'm the Outback Historian, Paul Rowe.